The third morning of the survey, in the long gallery at Renmore Hall, a gentlewoman in a plain grey gown unrolled a sheet of paper across a table built for richer things, and a duke who had crossed 2 counties to find a parcel of lost land, looked at her work and laughed. It was a short laugh, almost soundless, the kind a man gives when he has decided in advance what a thing is worth. The map was hers. She had drawn it by hand over 4 winters. The river corrected where the old county plans had it wrong. The boundary stones marked where she had walked to them herself, in boots that let in the wet. To the assembled gentlemen of the commission she was a curiosity, a vicar's penniless daughter who had been permitted to keep her father's instruments after his burial because no one else had wanted them. To the duke, she was less than that. He had come for the deed to a drowned valley, the field everyone called the Sunk Meadow, the one piece of ground that would settle a dispute worth more than her whole life. He did not know yet that the answer he had paid solicitors and surveyors to chase for a year was already inked to scale beneath his gloved hand. She did not tell him. She had learned in the 4 years since the fever took her father that a woman who spoke first was a woman, corrected, and so she let him laugh and folded her hands and waited to see what kind of man he was when he thought no one of consequence could hear him. Her name was Maria Thorne, and at 26 she had outlived the only future anyone had drawn for her. Stay with me, because what the room could not see in that grey gown is the whole of why this story is worth the telling. Her father, the Reverend Thorne, had been the sort of clergyman more at ease with a theodolite than a sermon, a man who measured the parish because he loved its hills, and who had taught his only child the trade as though it were scripture, teaching her how to chain a distance, how to box a compass, how to read the lie of water against stone. When he died, the living went to a younger man with a wife, and the new vicar's wife wanted the house. Maria had been given 6 weeks, and the instruments. She had taken lodgings above the saddler in the village of Coombe, Renford, 2 narrow rooms and a window that faced north, and she had kept herself alive by drawing maps for whoever would pay. A farmer's enclosure, a mill race, a parish boundary, perambulated for a fee of a few shillings. It was not respectable work for a gentlewoman. It was the only work her hands knew. And the thing the world had decided about her, the verdict she carried like a stone sewn into a hem, was that she was finished, that a woman without father or fortune, or face the world chose to see, was simply a problem the parish would have to feed. The Duke was Adrian Vane, the Duke of Hartwell, and the village had been speaking of his arrival for a fortnight before his carriage came. He had inherited Renmore only the spring before, along with a lawsuit that had outlived 3 generations of lawyers. The Sunk Meadow lay between his land and the holdings of the neighboring estate, and 100 years ago a river had changed its course in a single wet autumn and swallowed the old boundary, and ever since, 2 families had quarreled over which bank the line had run. Whoever could prove the original course of the river owned the meadow, and the meadow was rich, and the meadow was also, it was whispered, the place beneath which the old marl pits ran, the lime that would make a man's fields worth double. Hartwell had come to win it. He had brought a commission of surveyors from London, men with new brass instruments and no knowledge of the ground, and he had been told, almost as an afterthought, that there was a local woman who knew the parish maps. He had agreed to let her show her work the way one agrees to humor a child. He had not expected the work to be good. He had not expected anything of her at all, which was its own kind of cruelty, the kind that does not even know its own name. He stood now at the head of the long table, his coat a deep navy that the grey morning could not dull, his jaw held in the particular stillness of a man who had taught himself never to show what he felt, and he asked the London surveyor not Maria where the matter stood. The surveyor, a Mr. Pelham with soft hands, said that the old plans were contradictory, and that another season's work would be required. Hartwell's mouth tightened. Maria watched the muscle move in his cheek and understood that the laugh had not been at her map at all. Not entirely, but at a year of his life spent, and nothing to show. She might have spoken then. She had the river's true course under her finger, drawn from the line of the willows that only grew where the old bank had been, from the set of the church's foundation that had been laid to face the water as it once ran. She said nothing. A footman brought coffee. The gentlemen turned to other talk, and one of them, a Sir Gerald Crane who had attached himself to the Duke's interest, glanced at Maria over the rim of his cup and said, not quietly, that it was a charming notion to let the village spinster play a gentleman's work, and that her little drawing was no doubt very pretty. The word spinster sat in the air. Maria did not flinch. Her hand, though, resting on the edge of her own map, pressed flat against the paper as though to keep it from being seen, and that small, involuntary motion was the truest thing in the room. Hartwell saw it. That was the first thing. Though neither of them would have called it anything yet, he saw the hand press down, saw the color stay out of her face by an act of will. He recognized because he performed it himself 100 times a day, and something in his attention sharpened and then deliberately turned away. He told Pelham they would resume in the morning. He did not look at the gray gown again. Yet when the commission filed out to their luncheon, he found a reason to be last, and he stood a moment at the table where the map still lay. And he looked at it properly for the first time, and the stillness in his jaw was no longer the stillness of boredom. The willows. The orientation of the old foundations. A dotted line running where no London plan had thought to put it, annotated in a small, precise hand. Probable original course, confirmed by surface evidence. 3 seasons. He did not understand all of it. He understood enough to know that the woman he had laughed at had done in 4 winters what his commission could not do in a year. He rolled the edge of the map back down with one finger as a man might close a book he intends to return to, and he went out to his luncheon and said nothing to anyone. Maria took her dinner that evening alone, as she always did. Bread and a little cheese and the last of the week's tea, at the small table beneath her north window. Below, in the street, the saddler's children were calling to one another, and she listened to them the way she listened to most things. Now, from a careful distance, as a woman listens to a life going on in a house she has been told she may not enter. She unrolled the map again by candlelight. Not because she needed to, but because it was the one thing she owned that no one could make less than it was. Her father's hand was in the margin still, faint pencil notes she had never erased. A small bird he had drawn once in a corner to amuse her, when she was 12 and tired of triangles. She touched the bird with one finger. She thought about the Duke's laugh, and she found, examining it honestly, that it had not wounded her the way Sir Gerald's spinster had wounded her. The laugh had been about the work. The work could bear it. It was the other thing, the casual certainty that she was nothing, that crept in under the door at night and sat on her chest until morning. She did not weep. She had stopped weeping somewhere in the 2nd year. She trimmed the candle, and she began, because she could not help it, to redraw the section of the river she had been least sure of, and she worked until the wick guttered, and she did not know that 2 streets away a duke stood at a dark window thinking about a hand pressed flat against a sheet of paper. The next day he did not go to the commission. He came to the saddler's instead. Maria heard the boots on the stair, the wrong weight for the saddler, the wrong rhythm for anyone who had a right to be there, and she had the door open before he knocked because 4 years of being at others' command had taught her never to be caught unready. He filled the small landing. He had to stoop a little under the lintel, and the navy coat looked absurd against the whitewashed wall, and for a moment neither of them found the shape of the situation. Then he said, his voice level, that he wished to purchase her map. Not borrow. Purchase. He named a figure that was more than she earned in 2 years, and he said it the way he said everything, as though the matter were already settled, and her agreement a formality. Maria looked at him. She looked at the only thing she had made that the world valued, and she understood that he meant to take her father's 4 winters and her own, and put them in a portfolio with his name on the cover, and present them to the commission as the answer, and never speak her name at all. She told him no. She told him the map was not for sale. His brows drew together, not in anger, but in something more like incomprehension, as though a tool had spoken back to him, and he asked her why. She said, "Because it is mine, and because you laughed at it." The words were out before her caution could stop them, and the small room held them, And the Duke did not laugh now. He stood a long moment. Then he did a thing she had not expected. He took off his hat, which no gentleman did in a tradeswoman's 2 rooms, and he said that he had been wrong to laugh. That the work was the finest survey he had seen of ground he did not know, and that he had come to buy it because he had not the courage to ask her to explain it to him. The honesty of it was so unlike the man of the long table that Maria did not know where to put it. She offered him the only chair. He did not take it. He stood, and she stood. And through the north window the gray light fell on the map between them, and she found herself doing the thing her father had taught her, walking him along the river with the point of her pencil, showing him the willows, the foundations, the way the land remembered water long after the water had gone. He listened. That was the second thing. A duke who had crossed 2 counties to be told what he wished to hear, stood in a saddler's upper room, and let a penniless woman teach him, and when she had finished he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Come to Renmore tomorrow, and show this to the commission yourself." It was a command. It was, though she did not yet hear it as such, a shield. He had seen what Sir Gerald would do to her, and he was placing her where the man could not, and he did it in the only language he had, which was the language of orders. She came. Of course she came. She could not afford not to, and some part of her that she did not examine too closely wished to. The long gallery was full this time. The whole commission and Sir Gerald and 2 of the neighboring estates' men come to watch the village woman fail, and Maria stood at the head of the table where the Duke had stood, and unrolled her map and felt every eye in the room decide what she was before she had spoken a word. She heard the rustle of it, the small movements of men settling in to be entertained. Her hands were cold, and then she began to speak, and the years of her father's teaching steadied her voice, and she walked them along the river as she had walked the Duke, and one by one the small movements stopped. Pelham leaned in. One of the neighboring men, an old steward who had known the ground as a boy, made a low sound of recognition when she named the willow line. She showed them the church foundation laid to face a river that no longer ran there, and she said that a building does not lie about the year it was raised, and the old steward said, half to himself, that his grandfather had told him the very same, and no one had listened. The room had begun, without quite meaning to believe her. Sir Gerald's face had gone tight. The Duke, at the back, said nothing at all, and watched. And that watching was the warmest thing in the cold gallery. But belief is not the same as welcome, and the hierarchy that had decided what Maria was did not surrender its verdict, because a steward nodded. Sir Gerald let her finish, and then he rose, and in the smooth voice of a man who has never in his life been told no by anyone who mattered, he observed that it was all very ingenious, and that one must of course wonder where a clergyman's daughter had acquired such intimacy with the Duke's affairs, and whether the Duke's sudden interest in cartography was entirely a matter of boundary stones. The insinuation was so quiet and so foul that it took the room a moment to understand it, and when it did, the silence changed temperature. Maria felt the blood leave her face for the first time. The thing he had implied could not be unsaid. It was the kind of thing that ended a woman, that took the 2 rooms above the saddler and the few shillings of honest work, and made even those impossible. She had drawn the truth of a river, and he had drawn, in a single sentence, the truth the world preferred, about a woman like her. She gathered her map. Her hands did not shake, because she would not let them, and she said, in a voice she kept level by a discipline that cost her everything, that she had shown her work, and the gentlemen might make of it what they would, and she left the gallery with her father's map rolled under her arm, and the laughter of 2 of the younger men following her down the stair. The Duke found her in the courtyard. She had not got further than the mounting block. Her legs had stopped obeying her there, and she stood with one hand on the cold stone, and when his shadow fell across her she did not look up. He did not touch her. He stood at a careful distance and he said her name, Miss Thorne, and then he said, with the particular flatness she had learned meant he was holding something hard in check, that she would not walk back to the village, that his carriage would take her, that she was to wait inside the gatehouse out of the wind. Commands, all of them. Sit, wait, be carried. And under each one, if she had been able to hear it through the roar of her own shame, was the same word repeated. You are not alone in this. You are not alone. You are not alone. She heard only the orders. She told him she would walk, that a carriage would only confirm what Sir Gerald had said, and at that the Duke went very still. And she understood that she had told him she had heard the insinuation, and that he had heard it, and that it lay now between them on the cold stones. He said quietly that Sir Gerald was a liar, and that he would see to it, she said, more quietly still, that men like Sir Gerald were never seen to. Then she walked. He let her go, because there was nothing he could do in that courtyard that would not make it worse, and the helplessness of it was a new sensation for a man who had spent his life able to command any outcome he chose. What Maria did not know, what the Duke had told no one, was the shape of the grief he carried, and it surfaced that night in a way she would not learn of until later, but which the telling requires now. Adrian Vane had not always been the Duke of Hartwell. He had been a second son, a younger brother, and the title and the lawsuit in Renmore had all come to him, because the man who should have had them, his elder brother Frederick, had died the spring before of a wasting illness that the physicians could not name and Adrian could not stop. Frederick had been the one who loved the land. Frederick had walked every field of Renmore as a boy, and meant to know it as a man. On his deathbed he had asked Adrian to settle the old dispute, to win back the sunk meadow that their grandfather had lost, not for the lime or the money, but because it was the one wrong in the family's history that could still be righted. Adrian had promised. He had no feeling for the ground himself, no eye for it, and he had thrown money and London men at the problem. Because money and London men were what he understood, and he had been failing. And the failing had felt like failing Frederick a second time. In his breast pocket he carried his brother's watch, and in the back of it, behind the works, a curl of his brother's hair. He touched the pocket more often than he knew. That was the man who had laughed at the map. He had laughed because he was drowning, and a drowning man laughs at a rope he does not yet believe will hold the days that followed, were the strange suspended ones, in which everything changes beneath a surface that pretends to be still. The commission, against Sir Gerald's smooth objections, had not been able to unsee what Maria had shown them. Pelham, to his credit, had walked the willow line himself and come back sober and certain. The Duke required the survey confirmed, and confirming it required the woman who had made it, and so a thing was arranged that propriety could just bear. Maria would walk the disputed ground with the commission and the Duke and the old steward, in daylight, in company, and she would mark the original course on the earth itself. It was work. She told herself it was only work. Work, though, meant days in his presence, days of his level voice asking real questions and listening to the answers, days of the old steward's growing devotion and Pelham's careful respect, and days, too, of the Duke's hand at her elbow when the ground was uncertain, removed the instant she was steady, a touch that lasted no longer than it had to, and that she felt for an hour after it was gone. She began to know where he was in a field without looking. She told herself this was nothing. Her body, which had stopped expecting anything for itself 4 years ago, knew that it was not. There was an afternoon by the river that she would keep. They had walked ahead of the others. Not by design. The steward gone back for a forgotten chain, and the commission strung out along the bank, and they came to the place where the willows stood thickest, where the old course bent, and Maria knelt to read the set of an exposed stone, and the Duke crouched beside her to see what she saw. She showed him the tool marks on the stone, the way it had been dressed to sit in a particular line, and he was close enough that she could see the gray of his eyes was not gray at all, but a dark blue gone pale at the edges, and he was not looking at the stone. He was looking at her hands raw, at the knuckles from the cold, and the work, moving over the marks with a sureness that no drawing room could have taught. He said low that he did not understand how the world had looked at her and seen a spinster. The word in his mouth was not Sir Gerald's word. It was stripped of its cruelty and left only with its stupidity. And Maria felt something in her chest turn over that she had no name for and no permission to feel. she said. His attention was generous. He said it was not generous, it was merely accurate, and that there was a difference, and that she of all people should know it, since she had spent her life telling the truth about ground that other men preferred to lie about. The river ran. Neither of them moved. His hand was on the grass beside hers, not touching, and the not touching was louder than any touch she had ever known. And then the steward's voice came across the field, and they stood, and the moment folded itself away, but it did not disappear. She carried it home. She took it out that night, and looked at it the way she looked at the map, as proof that a true thing existed. It was the dowager who ended the suspension, as it is always the keeper of the order, who moves when the order is threatened. The Dowager Duchess of Hartwell, Adrian's aunt by marriage, had governed the family's social life for 30 years, and had come to Renmore the moment word reached her that her nephew was spending his days in a wet field with a clergyman's daughter. She arrived with a companion and a great deal of luggage and a candidate, for she had brought with her the Lady Honoria Finch, the daughter of an earl, 24, and decorative and entirely suitable. A young woman who had been told since girlhood that she would marry well, and who held herself with the unshakable confidence of one who has never been wrong about her own importance. The dowager understood Adrian's grief. She had loved Frederick too in her cold, managing way, and she had decided that the cure for a grieving duke was a brilliant match and a full nursery, and she set about arranging it with the efficiency of a general. She received Maria once in the small drawing-room, summoned on the pretext of the survey, and she looked at the grey gown and the chapped hands, and she said, with a smile that did not trouble her eyes, that it was so good of the Duke to find occupation for the parish's unfortunate cases, and that, of course, once the tiresome matter of the meadow was concluded, the girl would be glad to return to her little drawings and her quiet life. It was the spinster again, dressed now in silk, voiced in a private aside where no witness could swear to it. Maria curtsied and said nothing. The dowager had already turned to the more interesting question of Lady Honoria's gown for the assembly. For there was to be an assembly. The dowager had seen to that. A ball at Renmore to mark the Duke's first season as its master. The whole county invited the candidate displayed. Maria was not invited. Naturally, women who drew maps for shillings did not dance with dukes. She heard of it, the way she heard of everything, second-hand, from the saddler's wife, who had it from the laundress, and she told herself it was nothing to her, and she believed it for almost a full day. Then the Duke came again to the upper rooms, and stood again too large beneath the lintel, and said that he wished her to come to the assembly, not to work, to come. He said the survey was all but concluded, that the meadow would be his, by Michaelmas, that his brother's wish would be honored, and that he owed it to her. In front of the county that had called her a spinster, Maria refused. She refused gently, and then, when he pressed, less gently, because the refusing hurt, and she wanted it over. She said that he did not understand what it would cost her, that he could command a room to accept her for an evening, but he could not command it to forget her in the morning, that he would return to London and his dukedom and his suitable marriage, and she would still be here, the woman who had reached above her station at the Hartwell ball, and that this was worse than being invisible. She said the kindest thing he could do was let her stay unseen. He listened, his jaw set. He said he would not let her stay unseen. He said it as a command, and for the first time the command frightened her, because she did not know what it was protecting her from, and she did not know that it was protecting her from the smallness of the life she had agreed to accept. The dark came at the assembly, as the dark always comes in the brightest room. Maria did not attend, but the Meadows confirmation had required her signature on the surveyor's certificate, and Pelham, decent and oblivious, had told her to bring it to Renmore on the evening it was wanted, not knowing or not thinking that the evening was the ball. So she came in her grey gown to the servants' entrance with a roll of paper, meaning to leave it and go, and Sir Gerald Crane, who had been watching for exactly such a chance, contrived that she should be brought instead to the edge of the great ballroom, into the light, in front of the county, the candidate, the dowager, and the Duke. He did it beautifully. He had her announced almost as a tradeswoman come to dun the Duke for payment. And he said, in the carrying voice he had used in the gallery, that here was the very person, the cartographer, come no doubt to collect her fee, and was it not curious how attached his grace had grown to her services? The room turned. Maria stood in the doorway, with the certificate in her chapped hands and 300 candles finding every plain inch of her gown, and the dowager's fan stopped moving. And Lady Honoria's lovely face arranged itself into pity, and the whole county saw the spinster who had reached too high, exactly as she had told the Duke they would. Sir Gerald, into the silence, voiced the word a third time, gentle as a blade going in, and said it was a shame, truly, that so clever a spinster had not the sense to know her place. It was the dark moment, and it was complete, and Maria felt the door of her small, safe, invisible life close behind her. For good, she might have fled. The old Maria, the one who had walked out of the gallery, would have fled. Something had changed in the river fields, though. Some certainty that had nothing to do with the Duke, and everything to do with the woman her father had raised, and she did not flee. She walked into the room. She crossed to the table where Sir Gerald stood smiling, and she set the certificate down, and she said in a clear voice that reached the corners of the silent room that she had come to deliver the proof of the original course of the river, that the meadow was the Duke's by the evidence of the ground itself, and that she was paid in full by the truth of it, and wanted nothing more from any man present. Then she turned to Sir Gerald, and she said that he had twice now suggested she had earned the Duke's interest by improper means, and that she would like him to say it plainly here, in front of the county, so that it might be answered plainly. It was the bravest thing she had ever done, and it was very likely the end of her, and she knew it, and she did it anyway, because her father had taught her that you tell the truth about the ground even when the ground belongs to someone who can ruin you. The room held its breath. Sir Gerald's smile faltered, because a liar's power lives in insinuation and dies in the open, and he had not expected the spinster to demand the open. And into that silence, from the far side of the room, the Duke began to walk. He crossed the ballroom in long, unhurried strides, past the dowager whose fan hung forgotten, past Lady Honoria, past the county that had come to watch a woman destroyed, and he did not look at Sir Gerald at all. He came to Maria, and he stopped, and he took the rolled certificate from the table, and held it up so the room could see it. And he said, his voice level and carrying, that this woman had found in 4 winters what his commission could not find in a year, and that she had done it with no instrument but her father's chain, and that he would hear no man in his house question her honor again. Then he turned to the room, to the dowager and the county and the candidate, and he said the line, once, the way a man drives a single nail. I mean to marry her if she will have me. The silence after was its own held paragraph. No one breathed. The dowager's hand rose to her throat, and her mouth opened and produced no sound, the polished sentences she had governed the family with for 30 years, all gone at once. Lady Honoria went white, then, to her lasting credit, composed herself with a dignity her upbringing had at least given her. Sir Gerald looked about for an ally, and found in the turning faces of the county that he had none, that the room had recalculated in an instant who in it had honor, and who had only ever had insinuation. Pelham near the door said clearly that the Duke spoke nothing but the plain truth about the survey, and the old steward, who had no business at a Duke's ball and had crept in to see it, said in his rough voice that he had known the Thorn girl's worth since she named the willow line, and the recognition moved through the room like warmth through cold water. Maria stood at the center of it, the certificate in the Duke's hand, and his words in the air, and she found she could not speak, and the Duke, seeing it, did not press her. He had said his piece in front of the witnesses who had delivered the verdict, and he let the silence be hers to fill or not, as she chose. She did not answer him that night. That was the truth of it, and it was a better truth than a swooning yes would have been. She told him quietly at the edge of the room while the county pretended not to watch that she would not be married out of a Duke's sense of justice, that she had been a debt and a charity case and a problem to be solved for 4 years, and she would not be a fourth thing, even a beloved thing, that came to a man as a duty. She said that if he wanted her, he would have to want her, the woman in the grey gown with the chapped hands, and not the wrong he wished to right. The Duke looked at her, and something in his careful face came apart. And he said that he had wanted her since she told him no in a saddler's upper room, that he had laughed at her map because he was a drowning man, and had not known the rope for what it was, and that his brother had asked him with his last breath to find what the family had lost, and that he had ridden 2 counties for a meadow and found instead the only thing he had ever cared to keep. He took his brother's watch from his pocket then, and he showed her the curl of hair behind the works, and he told her about Frederick, the wound named once and plainly, and Maria understood at last what the laugh had been, and what the commands had been, and what the man had been underneath all of it. She did not answer him that night. She did not, however, say no. She said yes in the river field 3 days later, where there were no candles, and no county, and no witnesses, but the willows and the old steward pretending to mend a chain 20 yards off. It was the only place either of them trusted. The Duke had walked out to find her marking the last of the boundary, and he had not commanded anything. He had asked, plainly, a man with his hat in his hand for the 2nd time in his life, whether she would have him. And Maria, who had told the truth about ground that other men preferred to lie about, told the truth about her own heart, which was that she had loved him since the afternoon, he said. Her attention to the world was not generous, but merely accurate. They did not embrace in the field. Not properly. He took her hand, her bare, chapped hand, and he raised it and held it against his jaw a moment, and that was all. And it was everything. And the river that had changed 2 families' fortunes ran on beside them as though it had been waiting 100 years for someone to read it right. The dowager, in the way of those whose script has failed them, did not rage. She was too well bred for rage, and too intelligent in the end to mistake which way the county had turned. She received Maria a 2nd time, a fortnight after the assembly, and she looked again at the grey gown, and this time she looked also at the way her nephew stood at the window, with the set of a man no longer drowning, and she said with the smallest possible inclination of her head, that the girl had an uncommon head for figures, and that the estate had long wanted proper maps. It was not an apology. The dowager did not apologize. It was, however, a door opened a half-inch, a correction made by a proud woman in the only currency she possessed, and Maria, who had been given less and made more of it, accepted it for what it was. Lady Honoria went back to London and married, within the year, a viscount who adored her, and wrote Maria a note of surprising warmth, for she had never been cruel, only certain, and certainty can be forgiven where cruelty cannot. They were married at Michaelmas, when the meadow came to Hartwell as the deathbed promise had asked, in the small church at Combe Renford, where Maria's father had preached, with the old steward weeping openly in the 2nd pew, and Pelham standing up as a witness, and the saddler's children throwing the last of the autumn leaves. There was no great society wedding. The Duke, who had learned something about the difference between being seen and being witnessed, wanted none. Afterward they went back to Renmoor, and that winter the first snow came early, and lay along the willow line, so that the old course of the river showed white against the dark fields, visible at last to anyone who cared to look, the truth she had drawn now, written across the land itself. It is the map I think of. At the close, Maria had it framed at last, and hung it in the long gallery at Renmoor, in the room where a duke had once laughed at it, and on a winter evening near the year's end, she stood before it with her husband beside her, and a fire burning in the great hearth, and she showed him, as she had shown him in a saddler's upper room a lifetime ago, the willows and the foundations, and the river's true course. In the corner, faint in pencil, her father's little bird was still there, the one he had drawn to amuse a tired girl of 12 who would grow up to find what wealthy men could not. Adrian touched it with one finger, as she had touched it on so many lonely nights, and he asked her what it was, and she told him it was nothing, only a bird her father had drawn, only the first thing anyone had ever made just to give her joy. He did not laugh. He had learned not to laugh at small true things. The fire settled. The snow went on falling past the tall windows, white along the line of the willows. and the house that had once been only a place she was permitted to enter held her now as its own. Thank you for staying to the end of Mariah's story. If the gray gown and the willow line stayed with you, leave a comment with the moment you knew the Duke had stopped drowning. And then go and look, the way she taught him to, at the ground beneath your own feet.